Introduction to Foundation Paper Piecing, Making a Tulip Potholder. This is the foundation block that will be printed onto paper. The lines are stitching lines. The shapes are the finished size of the pattern pieces. So each shape needs to have a piece of fabric that is larger than it for seam allowance. Pieces 1, 4, and 6 form the tulip. Pieces 8, 9, 11, and 12 form the leaves. Pieces 2, 3, 5, 7, 10, and 13 make up the background. The large triangles in the corners are also part of the background but can be made with a different fabric. Piece 14 is highlighted to show it needs to overlap the other corner triangles. Note that this border area will be enclosed inside the binding. I traced the finished size of each piece from the block. That is shown by the dashed lines because those will be the stitching lines. Then I added a 1/4 inch seam allowance on the side that will be sewn down first, and more for the other sides. Those are marked by a solid line, which is where they will be cut out of the fabric. Okay. I'll be sewing directly onto this paper for foundation paper piecing. And I traced these with seam allowance guides for these other shapes. I decided to combine 11 and 12 and 8 and 9 to make a simpler shape and cut just a little bit bigger than that. Place the pattern pieces printed side up onto the back of the fabric to cut and mark. Cut a square. Then I just need to cut it with a ruler along the diagonal. That will give me my nice straight first stitching line. Marking the stitching line with the smallest seam allowance helps you place the fabric correctly, but it's optional. So I'm just going to fold the paper at the stitching line. The other stitching lines are likely to change, so I don't recommend marking them. So here and here. Maybe you can kind of see that. I'll do that with all of them. Give myself a little bit extra room to there. So you can see I've got a little extra room. Got notches. Just gonna finger press a little line in there so I can see. There we go. So if you haven't figured it out by now, this doesn't have to be all that precise. If you want to do it precisely, then there'll be less waste. But, so yeah, looks like this will work. Here I'm going to cut this at a diagonal from point to point. And then I'm going to cut this at the fold line. There. So that gives me my 4 little triangle background pieces. Cut that one out. Like I said, it doesn't have to be perfect. Continue to cut all the fabric using the appropriate pattern pieces. Like that. This one was not wide enough, so I took 2 little strips of fabric and sewed them together to make a big enough piece for these. I made an 11-inch square of paper just to make things easy because I happen to have tabloid size paper scraps. Oh, there's my ruler. But you could also just measure an 11 by 11 inch square Try to be precise. I'll just give a quick spray, just a light mist over this, and then press the other piece on top so they stick together. And then I take my other piece and I place it on top. You'll need at least about a 10-inch square of batting. That just temporarily holds them together. Foundation paper. Basting with glue works better than pins with this method. I have a couple things to help me. I have this Aleene's temporary glue, basting glue, and also this basting adhesive spray. I'm just going to use a dab of this glue because then it won't get in the air. But I don't glue it onto this side. This is the side I sew on. This is the side I put the pattern pieces on. So you might have a hard time seeing on the camera, but I can sort of see through the paper a little bit. If you use a thinner paper, you'll be able to see through it more. Or you could put it up to a window or a light box to trace so that you can see it on the other side. At the stitching line, I mean. Fold it over at the stitching line. Take I don't know if you can see that, but the stitching line goes from here to here, marking it with my thumbs. And so I'm going to be lining it up along the line between 1 and 2, this line here, starting and ending like that. But I'm going to do it on the back side where you might not be able to see the line very well on the camera. So there's 1 and 2. There we go. A little dab of glue right in the middle of square 1. Line that up and press it down to tack it in place. And I'm going to put this right sides together, and I can see that it kind of lines up on either side there. And to help hold it in place, I'm going to put a tiny bit of glue just in the seam allowance. And that's it, just right there. Press it down. And handle it carefully because I'm going to be taking it to the sewing machine. And in order to sew it, I need to flip it upside down onto the machine and stitch it along this line. This is my stitch line. Sewn off camera. It's right on this fold line. I'm going to fold that back, fold back the paper right on that stitch line. And I don't need to, but if you had extra, you could line up your 1/4 inch mark and then cut along here, but mine is exactly 1/4 inch, doesn't need to be cut. Unfold the paper, then open up the fabric at the seam and finger press it back into place. You can take the back of your thumbnail. You can also use an iron if you want. Just gonna give it a little finger press here with the back of my nail. I've also seen people use a roller to press it down without stretching out your fabric because you don't want to get it all stretched out of shape. And I find it helpful to then take this pattern piece and glue it down by putting just a little bit of glue inside that square where it's supposed to go. And fold it back and set it in place. All right. That black doesn't really like sticking very well. So now, next piece we're going to put on is going to be in order. So we did 1 and 2, and now we're going to do piece 3. Since we're going to be putting on piece 3 next, we're going to be sewing along this line here. So I'm going to fold at that line, and the stitches go a little bit past that line there. So I'm just going to gently pull the stitches out of the paper, fold the paper back on that stitch line. You can also pre-fold your paper along these stitching lines in advance so that it's easier when it comes time to do it while you're sewing. So here you can see I have an extra fabric, so I do need to trim that to 1/4 inch for 2 reasons. It keeps the amount of seam allowance inside the quilt block more even, which you can tell from the front or the right side, and it makes it easier to line up your next piece. So since this is the next seam we're going to be putting in right here, so you can see my start and stop stitching and my seam allowance. I'm not going to fold it at this seam allowance. I'm just going to take these ends, and I'm going to put the seam allowance along here, and I'm going to match these ends with these the ends of the shape here. So I'm just matching them up with these lines, here. Since that's a right angle, it's just that simple. When you get away from right angles, it's a little trickier. Oh, I'm going to turn it this way. And I'm going to put a little bit of the basting glue just in the seam allowance, and just a little bit. I found that if you use a lot of glue, then you might, if you use your iron in particular, you might have issues with the glue burning or discoloring your fabric. And so I'm going to sew this the same as I did before, right along that seam line from here to here. I'm going to go from here to here. Take the paper, flip it over, stitch along the line marked on the paper. Back tack in the seam allowance right before and after the seam lines marked on the paper. I'm going to line my needle up to go right into that point at the end of my line. I'm going to back tack and then go forward along the line. And go past it by a stitch or two. And back tack. There we go. Got the point of my flower and the surrounding background pieces, 1, 2, and 3. The next number is 4, so the seam where 4 joins the pieces I already have on there, that's the place where I fold. There's a little bit of stitching on that line, so I'm just going to pull that back. Trim that to 1/4 inch. Well, I moved a bunch of stuff around. Where did I set? There it is. So, piece number 4 is going to be a flower petal, like this. And it's going to go with this long side here, like this. So it's going to be like this. Sewn off camera. We have 1, 2, 3, and 4. The next number is 5. This is a background piece, like this. And it's going to have those long sides of the triangle next to each other. It's going to cover up this area. So I'm going to fold along that line. I have to pull out some of these stitches again. So it just puts a little tear in the paper. I want to do as little damage to the paper as possible, though. And then cut my seam allowance to 1/4 inch. And you just keep going that way in numerical order. So this along here. And this is going to be centered. Basically, where this line is where it's going to, the seam is going to cross this seam here.
Continue adding fabric pieces in numerical order. Piece 5, piece 6, piece 7, put my needle right in the end of that line, back tag, and then stitch forward exactly on the line. When I get to the end of the line, just going to back tag. Okay, this is important to show you. When I finish sewing this, I did fold this fabric piece, or this paper piece back, right along the stitch line. But then I did not trim this to 1/4 inch. See? And I went ahead and I lined up my new piece without it being 1/4 inch. So now there's less of this fabric to flip into place. So I'm going to fold at these lines, stitching lines, check it. Here, fold it here, and I still have about 1/4 inch seam. And I fold it the other side of the triangle. I've got a lot of extra fabric there. So it'll be all right, even though I made that mistake. But I'm going to go back and trim that anyway to keep an even seam allowance. We just did 7. We're going to put in piece. We're not going to do 8 and 9. It's going to be all one piece, 8, 9 piece. So I fold that back along that seam line. And I can see I need to trim that. Combination piece 8, 9, piece 10, combination piece 11, 12, piece 13.
I want to point something out with this piece. I'm doing something a little bit different with this since I'm making it into a pot holder. And this whole outer strip along here is going to be where the binding is. So the binding is supposed to come right to this point and cover all this stuff up. But just to make sure everything holds together, I'm actually going to sew pretty far back here, close to the edge of the paper, and go all the way across to this other end, almost to the very edge of the paper.
Piece 14, piece 15, piece 16, piece 17. I finished piecing the block.
So I'm just trimming right along that paper piecing line.
right along the edge of the paper. You can just try to rip it while it's dry, but sometimes it really pulls hard on the threads. You can give it an extra crease along the sewing line, which might make it easier. So I've got some water here, and I'm just going to put, there we go, a light mist on there. It'll become a little bit easier. It softens the water-soluble glue, makes the paper tear more easily. I just use a regular stitch length for quilting this. I've seen people say you need to use a shorter stitch length so it will perforate the paper more and make it easier to rip this off. However, if you make a mistake, it's practically impossible to rip it out without having to start a whole new sheet of paper for your piecing, and it's difficult to rip out all those tiny stitches. I pressed this flat and dry. Flip it over. I like to put the spray adhesive on whatever side is smaller. This is going to be glued to the batting, which is bigger than this. So I'm going to spray this side. I'll just do it here. Just a, oop, I got glue all over there. Don't need a lot. Put my quilt block onto the batting. That. Ruler with your rotary cutter, or you can just use a pair of scissors and cut that out. Either one.
Trim the batting to the edge of the 9-inch quilt block all the way around.
So it's cut right along the edge like that. Do it to all four sides. I took the 1-inch square. I took one side of the 1-inch square and lined it up with the edge of this fabric here, and the other side of the 1-inch square and lined it up with the edge of the fabric here. So I know this is where the point of my fabric goes, where these two lines show the corner of the 1-inch square. That way it'll be a 1-inch strip of fabric here and here, and then it will also be a 1-inch strip of fabric on the other two sides. I planned out as simple a design as I could think of to quilt on here in one single pass, so I only have one starting point and one stopping point, and I'm not having to cut a lot of threads. And this is the design, but I changed it to being a square for each of these, so it's a little bigger. So it's actually these 5 equal size squares, but this is the stitching pattern. So I start at this point here, and I go 1 line, then I pivot to line 2, pivot 3, 4, 5, brings me right back to where I started, and then I go 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then I'm again where I started, and I cut my threads, and then I can, I can back tack before I cut, or I can pull the threads to the back and knot them or whatever. From the center of the square out to the edge is 1 and 1, 2, 3/8. 1 3/8. So if this is the center line, it's 1 3/8 this way, and 1 3/8 inch this way.
And that's going to be the same for all those squares. So you could change it a little bit, you know, change the exact shape of it. 3/8. 3/8. Okay. And just going to weight that down a little bit. Get a piece of tape. Okay, I got a piece of tape here. I'm just going to lay it along that line. So that could be a stitching guide right there. I don't really need this full thickness though. So I could take the other half of the tape and use it for marking the other side. It does seem like it's a lot more accurate. You could also use like a chalk powder that you dust right along the edge. We'll give this a try. So I've got one set of lines there, and I know that I need to follow the straight line and not this ripped line. So that's kind of nice having it ripped on one side. Helps me know which side I'm supposed to be working on. And then I need to mark the line going across, where this crosses here to here. Actually, it's in a little bit from that. It's going to be in about 1/2 inch where the binding is going to go to. It's right here. So where this line touches the edge of this tape is where I go straight to the other side. Do the same thing over here. Oh, I need to be able to mark it on the tape. Hold on a second. So, oh, 1/2 inch right here. Go up a little bit, closer to the edge. Right there. So this is where that line is going to go across. So right from this point to this point, like that. And I do that on the other 3 corners. Put my needle in right in the corner where the 2 straight edges of the pieces of tape come together. I'm going to try to stitch right next to that. Continuing, stitching through that tape. And then follow that to this corner. With the needle in, I pivot the fabric. Try to get this right in the right place. Needle in, and stitch to this next corner. A little bit farther away from the tape. There we go, that's better. Pivot. So I'm going to need to touch it up just a touch. There we go. It's lined up. And so I did the first 1, 2. Oh, my battery's going to die again. I did 1, 2. And now I'm going to go all the way to the other corner.
This, I want to point out, is an even feed foot, so it helps make sure that the top and bottom are fed through at the same pace. Okay. And go to this other corner. Okay. Now I'm going to come back to the spot where I started. I'm going to try to keep my threads kind of pulled out of the way. Okay. I'm going to sew directly exactly to where I started. I did not back tack there. I should have. So maybe I'll stitch over it just a smidge and then go back. And pivot. So to the corner. It's hard to look at this fabric, this polka dot.
Continue stitching through all layers.
And now I'm going to go back to where I started again for the last time. And I'm going to back tack. There we go. I moved my batting to the table to keep the cat off of it because she clawed at it and shredded some of it, and so now she's just on the table on my batting. So this comes up and over, and then this tucks in so that it becomes just the right length to end right at that point. And when I do that, I find that it's tucked in about like that. So I'm just going to be like a scant ½ inch. I'm just finger pressing this. Could press it with an iron. Or you could glue baste it. So I've got that. When I flip it over, it goes exactly where I want it. So I'm going to go ahead and glue baste this in place by just putting a tiny dab of glue just right in the seam allowance. And then just press it. Stick, the glue will stick it together. So I'm just going to do that on all 4 sides. I'm going to do it on these opposite sides first. There we go. Just double check that this one looks the same. When I fold this one back to exactly the right point, that gives me the full ½ inch, so I could probably go ahead and do the full, like ½ inch turned under.
Now we're going to need to fold up these edges and sew them down all the way around. One of the tricky parts is, you're going to start sewing, you're going to get to a corner, and it's tricky to make a nice corner. So you can press it or finger press it as if it's going straight, then you flip that ear over, and then you pull this fabric up and you'll have a nice little miter. But it's very bulky, so it's good to try some trimming. I'm going to start it kind of in the middle rather than at a corner, like at one of these points, so I can see where it's supposed to line up. I'm going to be sewing this down just on top of the edge of this as I'm going, just barely. It might be helpful to take like a little scrap of paper so I can kind of see where my edge is as I'm going along, and then just slip the paper out as I go, since this is very difficult to see. So I'm just gonna stitch down a couple times, backtack a couple of stitches, and then go forward. Yeah, everything looks good. Slip the paper in there. Triangle fold. This is my folded edge for my finishing, right along here. So before you get to that fold, just cut off a little triangle. There we go. Refold that, put it up, there we go. Come around. You could still be over a little bit more. There we go. Okay, now I'm overlapping, back tacking a little up. And that is the finished potholder. Just needs to be washed and then it's ready to use.